Science 40th birthday or anniversary party. On behalf of all of my colleagues at Science, and I mean my colleagues in the editorial offices, my predecessors, my associate editors, we are so happy to have you here today to talk about what has been going on over the last 40 years of Science adventure. By our rough count, that's something like 4 issues a year, which is, 1,200 pages a year. No, per issue, 200,000 pages, 1 million words, 5 million words. It's a lot of words. So what we were doing at the journal office for the last 2 years was trying to think about how you celebrate 4 decades and massive numbers of brilliant insights to do something like a retrospective of this fantastic journal. And we decided that what we wanted to do was to celebrate its creation. On 4 decades in, to go back and thank the founders. So we are absolutely thrilled to have with us today 2 of the founders of Science, Kate Stimpson, the founding editor, and Domna Stanton, the founding associate editor. And when we think about the founding of this journal, what is really important to think about is how they completely rocked established assumptions. Now, you're all in higher education, so I know that creativity and creation are profoundly gendered concepts. And according to the classic canon, women create life, pure materiality, totally dist. Men, as Freud told us, create ideas, civilization. They move to the abstract and claim the rational. And here we had 2 amazing young scholars, Kate Stimpson and Domna Stanton, who decided to create the abstract, to create, indeed, out of nothing, trespassing on the grounds of the gods. Because at the time they started thinking about signs, 1974, at the urging of Jean Sachs, the editor of the Journals Division of the University of Chicago Press, at that time, there was no women's studies. There was no interdisciplinary feminist scholarship. There was little inklings of research on women, a few classes at a few universities on women's literature or women's history. But they took this huge step to envision Signs, a journal of women in culture and society, to begin to gather together, commission, unearth, resurrect, create a whole intellectual tradition. And it's that intellectual tradition that we want to celebrate today. We want to celebrate its founding, and we want to celebrate the glorious 4 decades ever since. We have hundreds of authors who have shared their research with us in the journal. We have even more hundreds of reviewers who have shared their insights to help make articles much, much better than they had been. We have the enormous talents of the editorial staff at the journal who have been tireless in producing spectacular issues year after year after year. So we want to celebrate all of their work. So how to do this? Going back to the founders is fairly easy, as long as you prey upon all of their good nature and tell them how close New Brunswick is to New York City. And, just a small, beautiful ride on New Jersey Transit. So Kate and Domna very graciously signed on. But then there's this other question. How do you capture 40 years of intellectual work? We started talking about this in the journal offices about 2 years ago. And the first thing we decided that we would not do, is try to come up with some list of the best articles in Science. One, because it is totally impossible. We have so many spectacular articles in the journal. And if you read our publisher's report, we discover that 96% of the articles in Science are read every year online. We have one of the highest rates of downloads from the Science Archive, from the JSTOR archive, So we don't want to create competition among great feminist scholars, like who's number one. Well then, how do you celebrate this great tradition? What do we celebrate in this great tradition? If you look around the room, you will see, thanks to Kayo Denda, our Women's Studies librarian and the head of the Marjorie Summers Foster Center, she has gone into the Science Archive, which is housed at Rutgers University, and brought up some wonderful memorabilia from our long past. She's also set up some display cases that focus on the last 10 years, which is to say the 10 years that Science has been at Rutgers, copies of all of our issues, some of the big events, some great posters from this work. So we have a wonderful archival exhibit here, thanks to Kayo. But we also thought a few artifacts don't begin to capture the richness of this intellectual tradition. So how do we do that? And we're a small staff. We have Miranda Kramer, who is our managing editor, the longest Science employee at Rutgers, 14 years at Science, 12 years as managing editor. Andy Masachi, our deputy editor, who has been at Science since graduate student. So he has a long tenure with us, but only recently well paid, or not well paid. A little bit paid. We have two graduate research assistants, Susanna Galan and Lindsay Whitmore. And this is the team we started talking to about what do we do to commemorate this event. We have wonderful associate editors, almost 50 of them. One of them, Dana Britton, volunteered to start teaching us en vivo, how you use textual analysis technology to begin to think about this huge archive. It also requires preparing the archive for data analysis, which is vast amounts of work. So Andy, Lindsay, and Susanna spent an impressive amount of time struggling with data preparation, having painful conversations with Jay Storr, who acknowledged that there were flaws in the data but refused to fix them, or promised to fix them and then refused to answer emails for months at a time. So in the course of their adventures with en vivo and trying to do social science content analysis, Andy Masachi met Andrew Goldstone in our English department here at Rutgers and decided he would do some interesting conversing with Andrew Goldstone, who among his many specializations does digital humanities and computational analysis of humanities journals. So Andrew Goldstone had this brilliant idea to create an algorithm that isn't like content analysis where you program what you want to look for in the data, but simply measures words that co-occur with some regularity. So Andrew Goldstone, working with Andy and Susanna and Lindsay and Laura Lovine, who joined our staff last summer as the acquisitions manager and media relations specialist, they all decided to do this collaborative work to see what they could come up with. First, they had 100 discourses they were tracking over 40 years. Then after investigating the thes and ands and buts, kind of came down to 75 frames of ideas that were coming and going over time. Then more fine-tuning, and I think we ended up with 65? 70.
70 enforcement.
There we go, 70.
It started with 60. You upped it.
Okay. Yes.
Inflation.
All right. So they're tracking words, and if you look at this gorgeous graph, that is a visual image of certain concepts and ideas changing over 4 decades in science. Now, on our panel today, we are going to have the brilliant people who actually produced the topic models tell us much more about this process. But it became clear to all of us that identifying these discourses and interpreting them were very different projects. So we reached out to lots of different scholars, some senior scholars, some young scholars, junior scholars, rising stars, and asked them to look at the topic model and come up with interpretations. And when Kate makes this joke about the number changed, what she's pointing out is that we all started working on one set of topic models, and then, whoops, it wasn't exactly the same as the final product. But that's okay. Creativity comes to the fore. So today we are going to hear two sets of panels. We're going to start with what I'm calling our foundational, exciting creativity approach. And then we'll shift functions and move on to our young scholar, genius, digital humanities approach, and collectively celebrate what science has been, is, and will continue to be. So in the first part of our panel, we are going to start with founding editor Catherine Stimson. If I were to give the kind of introduction that each one of our panelists deserves, I would talk for 2 hours and nobody would get to learn about our exciting history of the journal. But I hope that you all know that both Kate Stimson and Donna Stanton are past presidents of the Modern Languages Association. Both have dozens of works to their name. I'm talking now book-type works, not to mention hundreds of journal articles and book chapters. They both have done extraordinary things over the course of their careers. They have lectures named after them, prizes named after them. They are astonishingly productive, innovative feminist scholars, and each of them has a book out in 2014. Just to show you that feminism is constantly giving people creativity and energy. Following Kate and Domna, Susan Sadlauskas, who is also an associate editor of Signs, and who is one of these incredibly generous scholars, who even on a year when she has a Guggenheim Fellowship, one of the most prized, prestigious fellowships in the humanities and social sciences, has taken time from her all too precious research agenda to analyze the cover art and the visual aesthetics of Signs. So Susan's going to share with us some of her thoughts. And Kayo Denda, this colleague who is the first person, years ago, I forget how many, who tried to introduce me even to the world of information technology, and how, I think she's the first person who explained to me what meta-tagging of data was. Kayo is going to share with us some thoughts about signs in the archive. So please join me in welcoming our first panel on Signs at 40.
Sorry. Thank you. I want to thank the incomparable Mary Hawksworth and her colleagues for bringing us together. And I have to say, I love the virtual Signs. It seems like the most extraordinary culmination of 40 years of change and of work. So thank you for bringing us together. And I also want to remind us all how appropriate it is that we are at Rutgers, because this great institution was a part of Signs from the beginning. Domna taught here for 5 years. I was here at Rutgers from 1980 to 1998 with some time out to go to the MacArthur Foundation. So we are also at Rutgers faculty members. But when Signs began, Joan Burstein in education became associate editor with Domna. Ruth Mandel was on the editorial board. She was then at the Eagleton Institute. Elaine Showalter was on the first editorial board. Froma Zeitlin in Classics was on the first editorial board. And these women, along with others such as Mary Hartman, had already made Douglas and Rutgers a center of the illuminating, often flaming, often incandescent inquiries and discoveries of women's studies. Now, in the midst of such inquiries and discoveries, and my own peculiar exuberances, I was given the most beautiful opportunity. I was not yet 40 years old. Signs is older than Domna and I were when we became founding editors. I was barely tenured as a member of the English department of Barton College, and being in women's studies had not done my tenure case any good. As Mary said, the University of Chicago Press had, as the director of its journals division, a charming, tough, shrewd woman, Jean Sachs. And we cannot talk about the origins of science without remembering Jean. She had meticulous manners, and she was loyal, but she lived hard. Those nights when I was taken out to dinner with Jean and her husband Shelley Sachs, a great critic at the University of Chicago, the worst hangovers I have ever had in my life were after I went out to dinner with Jean and Shelley. She looked like Rosalind Russell with blonde hair, and Rosalind Russell might have played her in the movies. And in the early 1970s, she decided that she ought to do something for women, quote unquote. She came east to find an editor. I understand later that Carolyn Heilbrunn had turned her down. So she wandered into a conference called The Scholar and the Feminist. You remember them. And I'd been one of the primary organizers of that event. We sat down for a Barnard lunch. You know, the sandwiches in college cafeterias have not changed over 40 years. They've added wraps, but they're still really the same thing. Jean and I began to eat our sandwiches. She then whispered around to two people in the social sciences, asking the question, does she know how to do charts and graphs? She's in literature. And those two women, Donna Shalala and Pat Graham, put their hands up, one hand up in the air, crossed the fingers of the other hand, and said, oh, she's great on charts and graphs. And that day, Jean asked me to be the founding editor of the journal. An irresistible invitation. When that woman moved, she moved fast. And it was the relation, wouldn't you agree, Mary? It was the relation with the University of Chicago Press that sustained and has sustained and did sustain science. Donna was in Friendship Barnard, and I remember vividly sitting on a stone bench in front of Barnard Hall and turning to Damna and saying, Damna, I have this opportunity. We could start this journal. It's about women's studies. And do you want to be the associate editor and do the international work? Because we have to go do international work. Damna said, I'll think it over. That took a few seconds, I'm afraid. And we had so much to do. We had to find a name. And some of you have heard the stand-up comic story of our search for a name. Matrix, not the movie, but women's wombs, or Pharos. Pharos, not a language, but Pharos, the lighthouse, off the coast of Alexandria. We came up with signs, literally, when we were going to press. Believe it or not, one of our most controversial decisions was whether or not we should have footnotes. Those of you who were in your 20s at the time, let us dabble down the road of feminist essentialism, where there was a common belief that were female and male styles of scholarship, and the female was lyrical and emancipatory, and the male was linear, domineering, and tied up with footnotes. We, as I said, thought this essentialist. I also think the footnote is an art form. We also wanted male editors and contributors. The first issue had Robert McClatchy, an economist now dead, and we looked for science. So our next stab at gender inclusiveness were two scientists, William J. Bremner and David M. de Kretzer, in their article on contraception for males. A little family secret. Bill Bremner was and is my brother-in-law. So I went to him and said, we're going to have to peer review this bill, but we really need some male scientists. And he passed the peer review. And from time to time he tells me that science is still the great anomaly on his very distinguished scientific and medical resume. I believe the job of an editor is to find ideas and seize them. Look for emerging patterns and connections and seize them. Find writers and nurture them, and make language as eloquent and as lucid as possible. We would prize originality and rigor, and those were our watchwords. are austere. I'm so glad you're doing the covers. This was the first cover. Austerity, black austerity. Also say, don't mess with us. We're not giddy and girly. We are austere, original, and rigorous. We knew we had to be interdisciplinary. We knew we had to be inclusive. Although our attention diversity within the United States had to grow, we knew we had to be international. And Dogma will speak to that. But our first editorial said this, our first paragraph. Journals should have an animating purpose. For Signs, Journal of Women in Culture and Society, that purpose is to publish the new scholarship about women, both from within the United States and other countries. Like any decent scholarship, the study of women must avoid the luxury of narcissism. It must be neither limited nor self-reflexive. It is a means to the end of an accurate understanding of men and women, of sex and gender, of large patterns of human behavior, institutions, ideologies, and art. We did no beta testing. We had no focus groups. We had no idea if we would succeed or not. We began in faith and with hope, and in the secure knowledge that we were part of a historical movement. The censorship I feared was internal and psychological. I feared a self-setting of limits. And that historical moment, and the Academy, despite my tenure, if I did accept us, I was in Chicago meeting Jean, doing financial planning, when I learned that we had over 8,000 subscribers. We were 3 years in. We had 8,000 subscribers and we were in the black. Not the cover black, the financial black. I screamed. The University of Chicago Press, I literally screamed with disbelief and dislike. Then, in the middle of our editorship, the core group, and I do have to tell you, the core group included a young sophomore at Barnard College who wandered into the office to be the editorial assistant. I say the office, one small room, as big as this table, with 2 Selectronic typewriters and a small refrigerator, because we very much believed in cheap champagne as the fuel of our journal. And that young woman was Martha J. Nelson, who went on to become the first woman editor-in-chief of Time magazines. But there we sat, and I remember asking about the future, how long we should continue, how we could keep the journal fresh. And with surprising celerity, we decided that we should ask the University of Chicago Press to find new editors after we'd done 5 volumes, establishing a practice that has continued, though I thank the goddess that Mary did nearly 10. Why are you doing this? Asked Elizabeth Hardwick in her Kentucky accent. The writer, who was a member of our advisory board, contributed, "This is silly, Kate. Editors only make their name if they're there for years and years and years." But our belief was that the field was moving so rapidly that it needed editors who rotated with new perspectives. We were also feminists, schooled in collaboration and in the morality of sharing, a beautiful opportunity. And I, though deeply happy, felt a tug of restlessness and a compulsion to begin again and again. Remember, I was barely into my 40s. And as I regard the editorship of Mary Hawkesworth, its reach and imagination and care, I realize more deeply than ever before how right this decision to have rotating editors was. Mary, you have been incomparable, and we are all so much in your debt. Thank you.
So obviously, we're incredibly pleased to be here. We've survived all these years, so that's kind of extraordinary, but also just to celebrate the wonderful work that you, Mary, and your editorial team have done. But frankly, I'm a tad stunned by the entire experience, because when we sat around a Barnard College seminar room in 1974, trying to figure out the shape, and even more difficult, the name of our unborn journal, we never imagined that Signs would be in existence, indeed wondrously thriving in 2014. And by the way, aren't you glad that it's not Matrix or Pharos or Kate's favorite, Fulcrum, which I love.
I have repressed Fulcrum.
Though I must confess also that when the indomitable and ever-persuasive Kate came up with Signs, I kept objecting, but we're not going to do semiotics. We can't call ourselves Signs. So much for literal me. As Kate wrote in the inaugural editorial in 1975, we wanted Signs to point to directions that modern scholarship, thought, and policy can take, pointing, leading the way. That's Signs. When Kate asked me to become associate editor, I accepted for two defining reasons. Because over and beyond the idea of collaborating with Kate on this monumental project, we wanted Signs to publish critical theory, especially from beyond the national borders, and inextricably bound with that idea to develop a board of international correspondents who could ensure that we could communicate with women elsewhere, learn from them about the study of women. We didn't really talk about gender so much. Those fights, the women gender fights, came a little later. To see how such women had different approaches and thus how they might question what we were doing, even as we wanted to share our vision of feminist scholarship that would differ, to cite Kate's editorial from 1-1 again, from a focus on women or on sexual roles or from traditional scholarship. That inaugural issue listed 11 international correspondents, among them from Finland, France, and the Philippines, from Brazil, Israel, and Singapore. And today, the renamed International Advisory Board counts 53 distinguished names, at least 40 of whom are from locations outside the United States. And theory. Why theory? Because it seemed to us that feminist criticism had resisted opening itself up to incredibly important theoretical work coming out of Europe. Work that was negotiating the recent shifts in Marxist theory with Althusser and people in his orbit, such as Balibar, the recent explosion of new psychoanalytic thought with Lacan. His massive écrit had come out in 1966, and of course deconstruction. Derrida had been published in 1962, his Grammatology came out in 1967, and Gayatri Spivak's magisterial translation was to come out in 1976. Deconstruction would become central to the methodology of feminist practice, that is to say, demystifying the work of the symbolic order. In addition, in those early years, Stuart Hall had become already Director of Cultural Studies at Birmingham in 1972, and in the years following Signs would see the emergence of the Testimonio in Latin America, with its efforts to speak the traumas of history in Cuba, Guatemala, and Nicaragua, of subaltern studies in India in the 1980s, and so forth and so on. To be sure, there was some very, very vocal resistance on the part of some American feminists to all this theorization. Elaine Showalter cast her feminist self as Dorothy, to the new foreign theorists as the Casaubons. Remember that? But at Signs, we believed that critical theory had the power to produce a paradigm shift within the U.S. feminist community, and I think with historical hindsight, we were right. Thus, the inaugural issue of Signs contained the first ever translation by Julia Kristeva of part of her Chinese Women, which had come out in 1975. Subsequent issues that first year published Hélène Cixous's The Laugh of the Medusa, as well as an interview with Lucy Rigaray. As feminist theory took off in the United States, adding new constructs and new ways of reading, in my view, feminist critical concerns were shifting at home and have healthfully, productively continued to shift to this day. Most importantly, race and women of color, later post-colonial thinking, then queer, now transgender, and today, new materialist feminisms, disability studies, the post-human, etc., etc. Moreover, feminist theory and scholarship assume new directions coming out of the UN International Conferences on Women. To cite one example that has engaged my own work for the last 2 decades, women's rights as human rights, foregrounded in Hillary Clinton's speech in Beijing 1995. This crucial linkage has produced international and transnational studies on women's rights, and even more important, has allowed women around the world to invoke their rights through the discourse of the human rights regime. So in the little time that I have a final note, somewhat repetitive with Kate, but it is on the footnote. In the early years in which we published science, we were often derided for the endless footnotes attached to articles. Indeed, if you look at that first issue, Carol Smith Rosenberg's landmark essay, The Female World of Love and Ritual, has 79 footnotes in that article, and hers was not the only one. For a fledgling journal of feminist scholarship, and there were not many in 1975, as Mary has said, footnotes seemed one formal way of creating a tradition, of saying, look at all the ways in which this one text is embedded in a rich scholarly tradition. It was a subversive way, I think, of entering into penetrating the academic fortress that white men ruled with their universal we. Remember all that we writing? While designed to create legitimacy, the science footnote also thickened the texture of feminist texts beyond the eye's purview and placed a feminist scholar in close conversation with others, earlier and contemporary others, in the traditions of the humanities, social sciences, and the history of science. This was also part of the purpose, I think, of the review essay in Science, which I think was an incredibly, really a landmark feature also. And I'm sorry that Joan Burstein, an indispensable member of that founding team, is not with us today. To be sure, since the 1990s, there are fewer footnotes in Science, if I'm right. No, I don't mean that. We'll see why. I think that's really okay. But with a downturn in the publishing industry on the one hand, radical cutbacks in the university press budgets for monographs, but also with a dramatic upturn in the many lively forms of life writing. But I would also say that Science no longer needs the footnote that we needed, and we felt we needed in 1975. Science has become the premier journal of feminist scholarship over 14 years, a far cry from that moment when the four of us sat in a seminar room in '74 wondering how to birth the journal and the shape of its future. Thanks.
If I could just add a footnote. Volume 1, number 1, has from Hannah Papanek, The Work of Women, postscript from Mexico City. So you were in Mexico, weren't you, Charlotte?
I was too.
Yeah, you were.
Before I begin about the covers, a few words about Mary. When Mary first asked me to reflect on the cover art of Science last spring, it didn't seem like a terribly difficult task, fool that I was. And besides, who can say no to Mary? So as I embarked on this project on and off through the summer and fall with the essential help of Miranda and Andy, thank you both, I was soon overwhelmed. So many covers, so many artists whose work I didn't know well. And then I slowed down, looked at all of the issues, read many of the essays I hadn't before, and researched the artists who had provided the images. This saturation has given me not only an even greater respect for the scope and intellectual ambition of the journal, but has inspired me to start thinking hard about ways to build better bridges between science and visual culture, something I intend to work on with both my colleagues and my students. The past few months have only deepened my admiration for Mary's extraordinary leadership over the past decade. She's the kind of editor and thinker who knows how to nurture curiosities and connections that you did not know existed, and I am honored to have been invited to help celebrate both the journal and the fiercely intelligent, exceptionally kind woman who has been guiding it with such skill and grace. In an ideal world, we'd have a little less light, but it's either nothing or all. So we'll go with it. For nearly 20 years, Science had no cover art. The austere, white on black, is there another word we could have used? I'm not sure, it just seemed like the right one. White on black of the very first issue of Autumn '75, emulating the gravity of a scientific journal. The inflated, upturned geometry introduced in 1986, and the playful dynamism of the graphics used from 1991 to '97. The covers themselves became more visually arresting, a preamble of sorts to the commitment to the visual arts that the editors of Signs would make in 1997. Since then, nearly every cover has featured an image of a work by a living woman artist, selected with great care from an eclectic, ever-expanding inventory of women's art of an uncommon diversity. But what does one put on the covers of the most distinguished journal on women and gender studies in the world? Should polemics or aesthetics carry more weight in the choice? Should the artist be unknown or celebrated, old or young? Should the picture always serve as an analog to, if not precisely an illustration of, the content of the issue, or not? Over the years, the Signs editors have solved these quandaries by choosing all of the above, and thus, through digitization, offering an unprecedented level of exposure to women artists who might not otherwise enjoy it. Through the web, one can become acquainted not only with the work displayed on the cover, but with the entire trajectory of an artist's career, whether long established or still in the making. The covers of this one, 97. It's the very first. Haruko Okano's ceramic piece, Passing Through, was the inaugural image. A third-generation Japanese-American born in Toronto, Okano wanted to capture her parents' immigrant experience, which she does with this rather humorous amalgam of stasis and movement. A propensity to wander, that worked, has generated much of her practice in the last decades, as she works mostly outdoors, making ephemeral installations of organic or sometimes recycled materials. These were quite beautiful, a tribute to her Japanese ancestors' identities as hunters and gatherers. Certainly, there have been art stars on the covers. One of the earliest featured the work of the young Kara Walker, who had just received her MacArthur Award in 1997, so I can't quite say she was unknown then. I don't know if she was ever unknown. This is a section of her first large-scale cut paper piece called Gone, based upon Margaret Mitchell's novel, Gone with the Wind. The full title of Walker's piece is actually Gone, an historical romance of civil war as it occurred between the dusky thighs of young negress and her heart. The hand-cut black silhouettes, a throwback to 18th century domestic crafts, became the medium for a scathing critique of the history of race in America, and particularly in the city of Atlanta, where the film, Gone with the Wind, was set and where Walker spent her young adult life. She studiously avoided Mitchell's book for years, she says, but discovered she loved its melodrama, even as she lamented its insidious racism. Walker has said that whiteness is just as artificial a construct as blackness. A pronouncement she materialized to startling effect this past summer. I hope some of you saw this. Yeah, good. Lots of heads nodding here. That's good. With her piece, which is called A Subtlety, or the Marvelous Sugar Baby. Subtlety is the name of the dessert. A 35-foot high sculpture of bleached white sugar with a styrofoam base installed inside the sticky walls of the soon-to-be-demolished Domino Sugar Warehouse in Williamsburg. I suppose I meant to say Williamsburg, Virginia, right? This white sphinx, let's tap it a little harder. This white sphinx possesses decidedly African features, an Aunt Jemima bandana, and haunches that recall the tragic figure of the South African woman, Saartjie Baartman, the so-called Hottentot Venus, displayed in a cage for all Europe to see, where she is on the right. And of course, this Saartjie has white features rather than African features. Sort of strange reverse racism. Walker's Sugar Baby, surrounded by 13 blackamoors, sort of, cast in molasses and resin, reminds us that it was the slave trade that made possible the abundance of bleached sugar needed for all those elaborate, expensive delicacies called subtleties. Francesca Woodman, another celebrated artist in the series, provided a study for space for the cover of the 2002 issue. Only she was not around to see it, so employed. Woodman had made these photographs over 25 years earlier, as a young woman at the Rhode Island School of Design. It has become impossible to separate Woodman's biography from her prodigious art. She took her own life at the age of 22, within a year of the last iteration of space. Her spectral presence, in image and in memory, needs to be like hit instead of tapped. Now I'll tap. There she is. Continues to haunt the art world. She would have been 56 now had she lived. And I never actually thought about that she would be 56. She is permanently 24 years old. One wonders how she would have deepened or altered her vision of the female body in domestic spaces, this is from her series called House, that deliver anything but safety and containment. It is difficult to accept that we will never see how Woodman, with her passion for dematerialized bodies and hallucinatory time shifts, would have exploited the resources of the digital age. Okay, I'm trying every spot here. Unlike most contemporary art journals, Signs has given a wide audience to very young women of color. From the cover of an issue on youth culture, an androgynous but seductive figure is ready to knock the reader out with her huge fist. She has a knife in her right hand, just in case. The piece is called Bamboo Girl in Action. Bamboo Girl, demonstrating her skills in the martial arts, is the alter ego of Sabina Margarita Sandata and the eponymous heroine of Sandisa's Zine. A self-described queer Filipina mestiza, Sandata makes Bamboo Girl for a particular audience. This is her quote, by, for, but not exclusive of, young, loud women of color. The international reach of Signs, let's see. Is a model for other publications. The international reach, you get that. Zeneb Sadira's Spectral Djinn, which is actually one of a multiple, there it is, adorns the cover of a special issue on visual culture, 2006. The internationally celebrated Zadira moves both physically and psychologically between Algeria and France, as did her parents, transformed, as she puts it, from freedom fighters against French colonial rule in North Africa to economic migrants in France. Sadira's ghostly djinn, which refers to a supernatural creature in both Islamic and Arab mythologies, seems poised precisely between the moment of coming into being and dissolving into the ether. I was going to say around her, but probably I should say around it. Li Yan's What If the Long March Had Been a Women's Rights Movement? I love this. Provided the cover art for a 2006 issue on, among other things, comparative perspectives in democratization. A topic the artist is well placed to ponder in view of her 30 years in the People's Liberation Army from the age of 14. She was in succession a soldier, an officer, and a nurse. After retirement, Li Yan enrolled in the Military Art Academy and the Military Art class, and happened to meet Judy Chicago, who was spending time in China, from whom she learned all about feminist art, which she otherwise would never have known. Li Yan and her collaborator, Tang Zhigang, were responsible for the first digital photographs ever produced in China. It was quite extraordinary. Here, dressed in camouflage, she gazes through binoculars to a past she has imagined into being by replacing an iconic group portrait featuring Chairman Mao and his acolytes with their wives. She continues to reference the military by using her own army uniform to fashion an impossible tea set out of camouflage, which she calls the pattern of chaos. Michelle Magema also uses photography in her installation work, as well as her own figure as protagonist. Born in Kinshasa, now based in Paris, Magema supplied Goodbye Rosa for a 2005 issue on intersectionality, which fittingly is half of a diptych. In homage, can you talk and press a button at the same time? In homage to Rosa Parks, whom Magema observes is not much spoken of in France. I'll get it. The distinguished South African artist Judith Mason's three-part installation introduces the most recent issue, and co-edited by Miranda, which is dedicated to gendered bodies in the protest sphere. Mason's piece, made during the Truth and Reconciliation hearings and now hanging permanently in Pretoria's Constitutional Court, honors two liberation activists who were executed. The man who sang, apparently an African anthem, and the woman who was silent, and that is the name of the piece. The dress at the center, which is flanked by images of predators, is made of discarded blue plastic. The woman Mason refers to was kept nude during her entire incarceration, but made panties for herself out of this very material. Mason's words are written directly on the dress, and there are many, but among them are, "Your weapons were your silence and a piece of rubbish." Some covers are themselves performative. You can barely see the black, but that's okay. Enacting the themes inside. The Polish painter, filmmaker, photographer, and installation artist, Bonia Borszka, provided the art for both Volume 1 and 2 of a series on war and terrorism in 2007. Both images are rather terrifying to behold. Borszka produces what she calls clots of blood by smearing paint directly with her hands on a variety of surfaces, cloth, glass, walls. The white and black paintings are quite different. If I could get this. Okay. The red paint on black ground is a barely contained mass of chaos, rimmed by hands that seem permanently trapped inside. I don't know if you can see them, they're really spooky. In the red on white painting, it's almost as if the mass has disintegrated and exploded outward. The hands remain, but in this instance, many of them are the scale of a child's. So much for smooth transitions. Laura Splan's Gloves, one of the most beautiful of the science covers, I think, and this is for an issue co-edited by Andy, draws us into an issue that features a symposium on medical tourism. These seemingly elegant, if slightly ragged objects are made not of lace, but of translucent facial peel cast from the hands of the artist herself. Splan deliberately confounds the difference between the constructed and the biological skin, which, as this detail shows, becomes more disturbing the longer we look at it. It's as if Splan had abandoned her own skin, a kind of self-flaying. We are reminded that the phrase, "the gloves are off," is a preface to brutality. There is one last image that distills both the reach and the limits of digitization. I think it's right back here. It's one of the favored images, I think, of the whole science production. A 2013 issue dedicated to women, gender, and prison, which represents a detail of a large-scale charcoal drawing made in a collaboration by two artists, Tony Bowers and Natasha Ward. The women were part of an arts and education program within the Alabama State Prison. This image's association with the journal has meant that it has been widely circulated already, not only within the world of JSTOR, but in the publicity associated with the program, which is, amazingly enough, still alive and run by Auburn University in Alabama, with recent funding, even more amazing, from the NEA. I know, $55,000, but still. That's huge these days. Okay, just a couple more of these things. Here, on the right, is Natasha Ward herself in mid-production. It is her hand that has become an integral part of the piece, a graceful dark counterweight to the slightly smeared white handprints, a combination which I suspect is the key to the image's potency. She holds up the full-scale drawing. I hope I can get this. That's her. That she and Tony Bowers made together, proud of what the two of them accomplished. But the detail, a slate of editorial cropping, is more effective. Well, you know once, it's right back there, is more effective than an image of the complete drawing would have been. Here we go. Because it allows for a close look at both the organic shapes of the piece, which are quite beautiful, they sort of look like amoebas, and the perfectly integrated hand of its maker. The presence of this hand makes it impossible for us to identify ourselves against a woman who happened to produce this work within the confines of a prison. Digitization is a vexed issue for art historians. I've shown you objects and installations of wildly diverse scale and mediums, but through the magic of PowerPoint, they all look roughly the same size, and their materiality is impossible to experience. It goes without saying, but relying on projections like these always carries the risk of flattening not only an artwork's physical presence, but the complexity of its meaning and context. Okay, that's my art historical remark. That said, the case of Natasha Ward and Tony Bowers represents digitization at its best because it has provided two talented women likely to spend most of their lives incarcerated with a passage to the world outside where a potentially unlimited audience is waiting for them. Thank you.
So, as I sit here, or stand here, if you will, I am reminded of the April 2006, it was actually, that we celebrated here the arrival of the Science Journal here with Kate and other editors of the journal. And it's hard to believe it's been 8 years already. And now we assemble here to actually celebrate the Mary Hawksworth's legacy and also the hard work of the talented editorial office colleagues, past and present here. So we're delighted to have you. And as the only librarian on the panel, I was very pleased to discover that the topic modeling that you see actually included the words library and archives. And they are actually represented as an information technology topic for the libraries, and the archives are actually represented in U.S. women's history. And I would like to think that their inclusion in many ways legitimizes the libraries and archives as players with central roles in this scholarship published by Science, thus contributing actively in the process of institutionalization and also development of the field of women's and gender studies. And also, I think their presence reveals a broad vision of the original editors, Kate, Donna, for an interdisciplinary journal with broad representation. The topic, information technology, which I should go there. Information technology. This gives you an idea of the distribution over the years. It does actually include words such as, in addition to libraries, includes words such as computer, technology, language, information, systems, and typewriter. These different forms of technology, technology-mediated fields, and digital contents have altered legacy practices, changed traditional operations not only in the libraries and archives, but also in all aspects of society. The distribution of the topic, information technology, over time, as you see the timeline going to your right, you can see that it peaked in 1990 with a special issue titled From Hard Drive to Software, Gender, Computers, and Difference. And the term with the most weight in this topic is actually computer, which is listed on top. And the top document is a feminist critique of the neutrality of systems of classifications in libraries and archives. The author, Hope Olson, is a library science faculty at the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. So in other documents discuss topics including computer culture, computer and politics of gender identity, virtual reality, and cyberfeminism. They all discuss issues of impact of technology from typewriters to cyberspace in lives of women and men, and analyze the complexities of dynamics of power mediated by technology. Going forward, as new generations of feminist scholars and digital humanists focus on different manifestations of technology, it is possible that upcoming iterations of this topic might include terms such as digital, network, tweet, etc., generating new relationships and infinite possibilities. The second topic, where the term archives is actually represented, that's the U.S. women's history. Oh, sorry. I landed in a different. I have to go all the way down. Thank you for your patience. Here. So this is a topic in which the term archives is represented. And as you can see, it does display a very different path. It was very well represented from the 1975 throughout the 1990s, but it had kind of declined after 2000. This topic includes words American, suffrage, 19s, papers, Boston, letters, England, sister, library, and club, in addition to archives. And although anecdotal, this collection of words suggests a significant body of historical research focused on 19th century Anglo-American women using records and archival collections. The notable presence in this topic in the first decades of science might reflect the priorities articulated by Kate Simpson and her colleagues, Donna and others, in making visible hidden histories of women and other histories that could not be forgotten and more visible. As an intervention, the journal created the archival section. This section included essays on specific archives and essays on American women leaders, and overviews of accomplished international women. I think most of you spoke about the international presence in the journal. And one of these women featured was Berta Lutz, a Brazilian suffrage movement leader in the first decades of the 20th century. The archive section appeared last in the fall of 1981 issue, coinciding with the time when commercial indexing such as studies on women abstracts became available, providing increased access to resources on women. The archive section of the journal also brought attention to African American women, such as the essay on Early Archives Committee of the National Council of the Negro Women. In spite of this essay, the topic of U.S. women's history makes no reference to this essay and also does not make reference to race and gender. This scenario might suggest an overwhelming presence of archives on Afro-American women compared to those of women from different backgrounds. Only recently, libraries and archives have started to focus more attention on marginalized populations, building robust collections of oral histories of women from immigrant and diasporic communities, or LGBTQ communities are welcome initiatives that librarians and archivists must undertake. These collections would most likely serve as rich resources while changing the dynamics of this topic. The recognition of archives as one of the central sites of feminist scholarship might have worked in favor of Rutgers libraries, and Mary already made reference to our archives as the repositories of the science material. And so we, Rutgers libraries, received the science record as a gift from the University of Chicago Press in 1987. The early records of science encapsulate the original vision, strategies, challenges, as Donna and Kate already referred to, and polemical debates, including the process of naming of the journal. And I would like to add a little more to the examples that were on the table. And Domina was one of the titles proposed. The Optima, Persona, Kairos, Kuklos, and Synthesis. As I understand, the journal almost became Synthesis. So, in closing, I would like to express really a collective thank you to Mary and everyone in the editorial office currently and also in the past. And I really thank all the intellectual stimulation of our conversations and many collaborative projects. I think these interactions have inspired us to rethink some of the paradigm in the libraries and also to recalibrate some of our practices in the digital age. So thank you very much. And I also would like to mention that the Science Journal had a huge impact in the area of library collection. Mary has generously donated all the review copies to the libraries. And to date, and I have the precise number here, we received an impressive total of 2,761 gift books. So we have added them to Douglas and also to all libraries in our system. So we have no word to thank you. So thank you so much, Mary, to being great colleagues to all of you, and also great neighbors on the chapel side.
One of the astoundingly wonderful things about Rutgers is it has provided such a wealth of talent for science. When we think of our associate editors, it's just a starship of feminist excellent scholarship. But our professional staff have also been extraordinary in their creativity and dedication. And what's been really amazing about Signs at Rutgers is that each person who comes in uses his or her strengths, intellectual interests, and contributes in profoundly interesting ways. The journal has changed and the journal offices have changed enormously over the past decade because talented people took it where they wanted it to go. And it's been really wonderful to see extraordinary young scholars produce what is now this amazing bibliographical resource. So to tell you more about Signs at 40, our topic model, we are going to have a whole young generation of scholars, 3 recent PhDs and 2 soon-to-be PhDs, whose areas of expertise are wonderfully rich. Dr. Andrew Masacci, the deputy editor of Signs, who also is the person who created SignsJournal.org, our spectacular website, and who blogs and tweets and does all these things to bring us into a world I know nothing about, will start off this part of the program. But I want to emphasize that Andy is an amazing feminist scholar focusing on feminist science studies and political economy. His dissertation, Bodies of Value, looked at plastic surgery and how it produces different kinds of value in transnational contexts. He will be followed, I think, by Dr. Andrew Goldstone, who is in our English department and who very graciously generated his enormous talent to help us figure out how to do digital humanities with this wonderfully rich Signs archive. Andrew's area of expertise are also amazingly broad. Modernism and non-modernism in both English and French literature, South Asian literature. Then there was this wonderful computational analysis of texts. So he's going to tell us more about the topic model itself, where it came from. Dr. Laura Lovine, who is our acquisitions and media relations manager, is going to talk about how we try to think about the difference between what computers, an algorithm generated for content and signs, and what human beings might think of as important topics over these 40 years, which generated curated tables of contents. And then our 2 future PhDs, 2 of our PhD students in Women's and Gender Studies, Susanna Galan, who is back for this event from Egypt, where she's doing her field research on sexual harassment, street harassment since the Arab Spring, and enormously courageous person to be doing research in such a scary place at the current time. And Lindsay Whitmore, who had the incredible intrepidness to have her qualifying exams change dates so that she could be with us here today, and who has also done amazing work in her pre-PhD existence on memory and trauma and on working with women who are incarcerated and recently released from prison. So I'm going to turn it over to this spectacular young group so you learn not only about the past, but about the brain trust for the future of science.
Thank you very much, Mary. So the project that became Signs at 40 started with Mary's relatively straightforward request to find a way of tracing transformations in feminist scholarship and presenting this online. In the many months since this initial conversation, the project has grown into a truly collaborative one that incorporates topic modeling, as you see here, edited tables of contents, a co-citation network graph, wonderful editorial commentaries from eminent feminist scholars, and as well as a cover art gallery that Susan discussed. So rather than try to explain everything that's online, I thought I would, for these brief comments, concentrate on the kinds of evidence generated by the project and potentially different pictures of this remarkable archive that emerge. One of our hopes has been that people will read across the different aspects of the site, across different topics, across the edited collections of articles and the commentaries, so that no one interpretation becomes solidified. So in some senses, the process of topic modeling represents a simplistic way of analyzing the science archive, algorithmically dividing it into a certain number of topics. And yet our hope is that it enables some of the complexity of the novel and distinctive approaches that have characterized feminist scholarship over 40 years to shine through. And the commentaries that feminist scholars have written, including those by Mary, Catherine Stimpson, Kayo, and Susan, lead me to believe that we have succeeded in this regard. As Catherine and several others point out, the topic model confirms some things that we already know. Such as the rise of gender as an analytic, the rise of bodies as a object of theoretical investigation. And as Andrew has often said, if the model didn't confirm the things that we already know, it would probably not be a very good model, or at least not a very useful one. But we also hope that the model reveals some things that we may not have known, what Andrew Goldstone and Ted Underwood in another context call the quiet transformations that have characterized the field. And indeed, what made topic modeling appealing to Lindsay, Susanna, Laura, and me is its capacity to obviate the stock narratives of feminist scholarship that Kelly Coogan-Gair's analysis of science also challenges. Because the algorithm doesn't know about first wave, second wave. The algorithm doesn't know standardized taxonomies of feminist thought into liberal, radical, cultural, etc. So it's in reading across topics and through different lenses enabled by Andrew's browser software that the complexities and complications to stock narratives emerge most clearly. So one narrative that might initially be seen as being confirmed by the topic model is the notion that materialist and structural analyses have declined over time in favor of debates about the politics of recognition. So one could note that the labor topic declines over time, and Marxist feminism declines over time, while discussions of the politics of different emerge in the 1990s and get increasingly prominent. Yet if one browses further, one can also find that the word economic appears in several topics, and that the globalization topic includes many terms associated with political economy, and it's come to prominence relatively recently. So what this suggests to me is that the terms have shifted, but analysis of political economy and materialist feminism is still very much alive in the pages of science. And you can also use as evidence of this the table of contents that Laura Levin edited that show on political, labor and political economy that shows over 40 years, not only have there been individual articles that you can see on the left-hand side, but also many, many special issues devoted to analyses of labor and political economy. And also at the level of individual articles, so here's the topic model's breakdown of Mina Muallim's Middle Eastern Studies article. You can see that it's equally devoted to politics of difference and globalization as the third topic. So this belies the notion that, well, at the level of individual articles, the topic model can reveal many articles that involve both politics of difference and discussions of political economy, which belies the notion that discussions of identity politics forestall materialist analyses. Going back into the archive, both via the topic model and through the process of editing the table of contents, instilled a deep appreciation of the editorial choices and labors that have produced the diverse bodies of work that make up the journal. From the review essays and field-specific appraisals of research on women and conscious efforts to establish women's studies as a field, to the decision to solicit and publish commentaries and critiques to advance feminist conversations, the archival excavations that Caio talked about, the translation of French feminist theorists in the early issues, or the establishment from the very first issue of a model of interdisciplinarity that remains largely operative today. But I would be remiss if I also didn't highlight Mary's contributions, sorry Mary, to the journal. Not only has she supported this anniversary project wholeheartedly, but her 10-year tenure as editor has certainly left an indelible mark on the journal. She has greatly increased the global scope of science as the globalization topic shows. And that's obvious if you pick up any one issue of the journal, but what's less obvious is the continuous vigilance, intellectual work, and editorial labor that had been required to make this happen. She has done it in a way that maintains and deepens the interdisciplinary commitments of the journal. She has provided extraordinary opportunities to graduate students at Rutgers and has been a wonderful mentor to many of them. And her commitment to advancing young scholars is evidenced in her establishment of the Catherine Stimson Prize, which is given to an article by a young scholar in any field and is awarded by an international jury of feminist scholars. So I think that this prize represents a real distillation of Mary's many commitments, a commitment to a transnational journal, encouraging new voices and new directions for feminist scholarship, while ensuring that it remains grounded in the immense body of work that feminist journals like Signs and the editorial work that maintains them have enabled. So,
I want to begin just by paying tribute to all the people at Signs who welcomed me and worked with me on this effort. When I first heard from Andy Gazzacchi, Susanna Galan, and Lindsay Whitmore last September, I really had no idea what I was getting into. And it's really been extraordinary to see how much we've been able to do together, and I'm just stunned by the energy and commitment that these three grad students, and then joined by Laura, put into this crazy project and to trying to deal with my own oddities. So it's really an enormous privilege to work with all of you, and I also need to thank Mary Hawksworth for kindness and patience, and for supporting this venture with all the intellectual and material resources of the journal. And lastly, to thank the Signs board. I want to mention that just because the meeting that we had discussing an early version of this model with the Signs board, I think was one of the highlights of my intellectual life at Rutgers. I'm just never, to take an experiment like this and discover that it leads to a whole set of conversations and challenges and questions from scholars in a whole range of disciplines is a rare experience, and a really special one for me. So this is partly my ritual and sincere expression of gratitude, but also to indicate the point of really all I have to say about this project, which is that there is good reason for the welcoming spirit with which the people of Signs have engaged in a project like this one, a project of self-exploration that uses both quantitative and qualitative methods. Both the reflexivity of this project and the mixture of methods are, it seems to me, central to the practice of feminist scholarship. In fact, I'd say they're much more characteristic of feminist scholarship than of the present-day humanities. So my view is not so much that the digital, this thing that goes under the name the digital humanities is bringing something to Signs, but rather that feminist scholarship and science in particular offers models that anybody who thinks about the digital humanities, the humanistic social sciences, could learn from. And I want to gesture to this just very, very briefly using the topic model itself. And I should say that actually, contra Mary, if I may, I think this is in the continuous tradition of content analysis. And in fact, one can learn a very great deal about the potentials of content analysis in the pages of Signs, and that in fact even applied to feminist scholarship itself. So this is just one more movement in this tradition of trying to understand patterns in feminist knowledge production this way. But really I want to call your attention to the most powerful data analysis feature of this algorithmic apparatus, and that's what you see here in the header, which is to say the combination of the quantitative, the curated tables of contents and the editorial commentaries. This is, for me, the real innovation here is that we take an algorithmically generated breakdown of the contents of the journal and put it in conversation with all kinds of other methods of interpretation. There are a number of things that came out for me in the commentaries that were particularly gratifying. One thing that I want to emphasize is that the model is not a totality. So the model doesn't tell us everything that's in the journal, and it's rather a kind of partial evidence. Brittany Cooper, in her comment on Black feminisms in the model, brings out something important in that famous politics of difference topic. She looks at this, and she looks at Black feminisms, and she asks, well, that's all very well, but where is intersectionality, one of the central concerns of more recent years? It's not indicated separately as a topic. Now, does this mean that our algorithm has proven the absence of intersectionality from signs? That would be absurd. It has done no such thing. It has rather failed, the modeling has failed to distinguish between intersectionality and this broader discourse, the politics of difference. And in fact, though it's not listed here, the 52nd most common word in this topic is intersectionality. So it captures this somewhat less frequent word than, as you can imagine, the word political, is reflected here, and the top articles are frequently articles with intersectional approaches. But this kind of vagueness of the model can be productive in creating juxtapositions, but it's also important to remember that it means that we're not looking at a totality. We're looking at interesting partial evidence. Nonetheless, I think that one partial evidence is really quite striking for someone coming from literary studies and interested in computational methods and literary studies, and that is this quantitative method topic. Which, let me tell you that when one looks at literary studies journals for quantitative methods, they disappear by about 1935. That was about the last time literary scholars bothered to count anything. Of course, science is something else. Even though there is perhaps a downward trend here, Dana Britton comments on this and speculates that it may have as much to do with feminist quantifiers moving into discipline-specific journals, you can still see the kind of continuing presence of using quantitative methods alongside other methods. And I really think that this interdisciplinary ethos in science is a striking model for many disciplines. And I want to quote one more time the founding editorial. It's just such an inspiring document. In that editorial, the founding editors say that the new scholarship about women has a mission to foster the accurate understanding of men and women, of sex and gender, of large patterns of human behavior, institutions, ideologies, and art. And the importance of the large pattern seems to me part of the reason for the mixture of methodologies, including the quantitative. And I actually think that this is a really central lesson of feminist scholarship, that it teaches us how to grasp intersections of large patterns with individual experience. But I don't mean to say that what one does with something like the topic model is to grasp the total pattern of signs. Actually, the real purpose of this gadget is to lead you down as many rabbit holes as possible. That's how I've used it, and the number of discoveries and rediscoveries is really an immense pleasure, and the main pleasure, I think, of this tool. But I do want to say that even if the quantitative is largely disappearing, you can use this little focusing to remind yourself that even in more recent years, the mixtures of methods have remained important, even as they are critiqued and questioned, as in this essay, on empirical methodologies. And so, in fact, if you use this overview, you can discover unexpected conjunctions in the journal. That, I think, is a real value of the model. So just encourage this bizarre vision that we have here. I wish I could zoom, but it looks like I can't. Here. So you can, scrolling over, one can just see this juxtaposition of many different discourses and methodologies in single issues or single years of the journal. And this is a model for the mixture of methods in analyzing culture and society, women in culture and society, that has a lot to teach many other disciplines, including the so-called digital humanities. So I guess I put this more strongly. If one wants to combine quantitative and qualitative methods in a new synthesis to study large patterns in culture and society, one can do no better than to look to feminists. I certainly wish to thank my feminist collaborators at Signs for all they have taught me.
Nice to see you. So, one of the most exciting aspects of the learning experience that has been working in the project Science at 40, and there have been a lot of exciting moments, but one has been the process of progressively discovering and imagining the many applications that this virtual issue, with the topic model, the creative table of contents, the co-citation network, and we will see a little bit about each this afternoon, may have for feminist research and teaching. In my presentation, I would like to focus on how Science at 40 can be used by TAs and faculty for developing WGS courses and units. I believe that this aspect is central to the project and it inscribes itself within Science's long pedagogical commitment under Mary's leadership, developed, among others, through the project Science on the Syllabus that you may be familiar with. And if you're not, I also invite you to explore a little bit of the Science website and look into it. The teaching component features highly in the editorial comments that former, current, and future editors of Science, scholars and experts have written for Science at 40. Caio, for example, notes how these new generations of digital tools open new possibilities, altering traditional methodologies with potential for new pedagogies. Also, Brittany Cooper, and I think I saw her before, sees the platform as something that would provide an interesting pedagogical opportunity for the students. And echoing Miranda's words, I would encourage you to lose some time using this platform and to remain open to the different connections and very surprising and unexpected that you will find among articles, topics, and words. Let me see if I can. Okay. So, because of time constraints, I will just briefly point out some of the elements at Science at 40 that may be useful when trying to design a course. And I see that there are many graduate students with us, and I think that especially for me, when I started teaching, it was a big challenge to think what to teach or what text to choose from all the feminist scholarship and also from different disciplines. So I will propose you a little example, and for this purpose, I have chosen that you imagine that you have to, or you want to develop a unit on space and using feminist geography or feminist geographical perspectives. And I have chosen this topic partly because it's not part of my expertise, and also to show you how looking into different fields that we are not very familiar with through the model can bring us to very interesting conclusions. So there are many starting points that you can choose, but I will invite you to go to the topic model. I think that this is one of the aspects of the website that allows you to explore more freely. And you can, following Miranda's advice, you can just look at it and inspect what kind of topics you have, looking at their titles. But in this case, I will tell you that there is one topic that is on domestic and urban. So this is the topic that we have identified as dealing with space. And here, as you can see, we can see that the different words that appear are city, home, domestic, and urban. You can click to this topic, or you can also access to it by the list of topics, domestic and urban, or through the overview of the topics list, whatever you want. So, let me see, because this is right. So you can see that the keywords that you find, the top words are domestic, home, urban, city, household, public, house, class, space. So you find a wide range of words that are related to space. Once here, if you look at the top articles, you will see, and especially if you're not familiar with the literature, it may be not so obvious from the first, when you start thinking about the topic, sorry, but you will see that Dolores Hayden is one of the main persons that is writing about urban planning and architecture from a geographical perspective. So browsing along these top articles, you will find all the different authors that have been publishing on this topic. But probably in this case, because the topic is so much centered on space, you will find that it's structured partly, especially among the top articles, along disciplinary lines. So, staying in the discipline, you can also see in the early proportion of words in the topic that there is a rise in 1980. So if you click here, you will discover that Science published a supplement, and let me see, so if you click on Dolores Hayden's first article, you will see that there was a special issue on women and the American city. So that also browsing through the, let me go behind, go back. So exploring the time graph, you can also see how existing discussions have changed over time, how the same discussions have been evolving, what new names have been participating in these discussions, and start having an idea about the questions that have been relevant in this topic. Also, if we want to focus, for example, in the top word in this topic, domestic, we will find also interesting connections, seeing that, for example, the word domestic features first in the topic domestic and urban, but the next topic is sexual violence, not surprisingly. So, for example, if you are interested in addressing articles that deal with domestic violence and violence against women in the home, you may want to explore the topic of sexual violence and find other articles and texts that deal with this issue. Going beyond the topic model, and Laura will explain a little bit more about the curated contents, you can also find a DOC that is particularly about violence and conflict. And here again, you will find a list of articles, but also in the right sidebar. And here I would like to encourage you to look beyond the selection of articles, because it was really difficult to select 20 articles that represent the width and breadth of feminist scholarship in this particular topic, and look into the sidebar to all the special issues, comparative perspective symposium, and supplements that Science have been publishing over time, dealing with aspects related to this topic. So, for example, in this particular question of violence and conflict, you find a special issue in 1983 about women and violence, and also in local and international perspectives. And here too, you can explore many different questions that do not specifically relate to violence in the home, but also make linkages between domestic violence and the nation state, for example, or explore beyond even your imagination of how you wanted to frame the topic. Another interesting, so let me go back to domestic. So if you go back to domestic, you may continue discovering the interesting aspects, like for example that globalization is also a topic where the question of space has been discussed. So if you go to globalization, you may find a lot of interesting articles that deal with the relationship between the local and the global in feminist scholarship. And also distance yourself a little bit more of the disciplinary discussions on a space in terms of nation state, and make the connections at different levels. And for example, one of the articles that represents better this interconnection between the global and the local is Carla Freeman's article, Is Global is local, global as feminine, masculine, so that you can find in this topic, also related to space. So as you can see, every one of these paths lead to innumerable possibilities and provides a wide array of options for thinking about space and place in the feminist classroom, well beyond our preconceived ideas of what are the aspects that we'd want to consider in class. Another interesting option that I would like to show you is to go to the overviews and topic space. Here you can see how the same bubbles that we had in the topic reorganize and cluster, and so the explanation is that it clusters with topics with which it has a similar distribution of frequent words. In our case, if we stay with domestic and urban, we see that our topic has clustered with political movements, and also, interestingly, with Marxism and feminism. So this also may give us some ideas about other aspects or other disciplines, other topics that may be related to our topic and that we may want to explore when creating our syllabus. And finally, another completely different way of analyzing it. So another entering point would be to go to the word view, in which you can just look for a specific topic. So if in this case I choose space, that is the most obvious word for my idea of feminist geography. Interestingly enough, here is bodies, the topic that is more prominent, even more than the topic that we consider to be the special topic of domestic and urban. So it also opens very interesting ways of thinking of space, exploring the topic bodies. And also, if we go to the curated contents, Lindsay Whitmore has created the TOC on bodies, identities, and difference. And for example, looking at the related content, we find that in 2011 there was a comparative perspective symposium about love exiles. So this may also give us completely new ideas about how to approach a space from less expected points of view. So as you can see, the possibilities are infinite. I hope I didn't lost you in the presentation. My idea was also to show you how this search can lead you in so many ways that are difficult to imagine in advance, and to encourage you to explore this platform on your own, and also to introduce your students to these tools so that they also can interact on their own with these possibilities and discover the different possibilities of feminist scholarship and deal with the archive. This is still a little bit scary place. Thank you.
Hello. Excuse my voice, after comprehensive exams, I got progressively sicker, so I'm coming out of that now. So as a bright-eyed, perhaps overly ambitious first-year PhD student on fellowship with just a little extra time on my hands before I began teaching in my second year, I applied to the position of research assistant at Science in February 2013 with little knowledge of what exactly that might entail. On the one hand, I was incredibly intimidated by the prestige of the journal. I had encountered its intellectual legacy and contemporary critical force just a few semesters prior in my master's program at NYU, as well as during my undergraduate time at Mount Holyoke, where I entered as a first-generation college student with very nascent, albeit very inquisitive, feminist leanings. In those earlier days, articles such as Emily Martin's The Egg and the Sperm radically challenged the givenness of the world around me, as I began to see what exactly it meant to be a feminist thinker in a world largely dominated by other kinds of knowing. In fact, the early science pieces that I encountered in my first-year seminar, Cultural Representations of Women, revealed to me that there were actually different ways to produce knowledge about the world, and that feminism was as much about making changes on the level of how we know what we know, as it was about reproductive rights or women's labor. Later, intimate encounters with Jose Esteban Munoz's Feeling Brown, Feeling Down, and Chandra Mohanty's Under Western Eyes Revisited provided an entirely new set of tools through which to disassemble and reconfigure my own emergent critical position. So although my sense of intimidation was strong as I embarked on my new position with the journal, I also brought with me a sense of familiarity and great passion. I knew that this journal was and continued to be a hub of preeminent feminist knowledge production, and the chance to even be on the periphery of that was beyond exciting. With this sense of being perched on the unknown at the center of my own reflections, I'd like to use this time to give a little bit of insight into how we got to where we are today. The evolution of Signs at 40, much like the evolution of the journal's entire 40 years, is due largely to the ongoing work of a team that's evolved and morphed based on many different strengths, investments, and critical insights that a shifting array of contributors have brought to the table. For me, becoming a part of this cast of creators was the most fulfilling part of this project. So, back to March 2013. In our first week of work at Signs, Susanna and I became acquainted with what felt like the top secret inner workings of the journal. We quickly received our main task. The 40th anniversary was fast approaching, and we were to begin exploring how we might open up the rich archive for both critical exploration and creative engagement. Our first route in centered on word clouds, those collections of differently sized words assembled together based on the prominence of a particular word, like feminism or gender, within a larger body of text. This is where we started. Word clouds proved a bit too static for our needs. We wanted to identify relationality and movement. At this point, we were also faced with the sheer immensity of the archive that we were working with. The breadth of Signs' 40 years of feminist scholarship became clear to us in a very different way. How to handle all these words, and Mary gestured to that at the beginning. So during these initial weeks, Susanna and I also met with Women's Studies librarian Kaya Denda for the first of several sessions of brainstorming and mentorship. Kaya offered up immense insight into Signs' 30th anniversary and introduced us to the archive of materials at hand from that period of reflection and celebration. Next up was a return to a previous noble attempt at organizing the Signs archive into some comprehensive system, in this case, a database. We supplemented basic editorial information on articles from the last 10 years of publication with very specific information on every single article from 1975 onward, including information about special issues, academic disciplines, and geographic areas of focus. With the generous support of Professor Dana Britton, we mobilized our database and tried our hand with NVivo, the qualitative content analysis system. We found that although the program was useful for manually coding documents, it could not necessarily generate the key terms that we wanted or to track changes through time. With the added drama of conflicting file names for over 1,600 individual PDFs painstakingly indexed in our database, this approach became increasingly unwieldy and left us dead-ended once again. During these months, Andy's guidance led us towards a vast array of tools in digital humanities, a body of work that I had not previously encountered and was admittedly a bit skeptical of at the outset. Working largely through the exchanges and insights contained on a dense network of blogs authored by individual scholars who were creating and using these tools, we swiftly fell into the digital humanities rabbit hole. This brought us to the fascinating work of Andrew Goldstone, who, to our great surprise, was right here at Rutgers, in the English department, just one campus away, and he was very willing to work with our team, whose deep sense of confusion was matched only by our eagerness to just keep going. We arrived to our first meeting with plenty of half-formed questions. Even so, Andrew enthusiastically signed on to the project, and with our eternal gratitude, swiftly exploded the terrain on which we had been working. In the months after this fateful encounter, Laura Loven joined our team as a permanent contributor, and I found myself in the midst of increasingly unknown digital territory. With the guidance of Andy and Andrew, I was suddenly working from the command line on my Mac, becoming familiar with, if not quite mastering, the realm of open source programming. Some days I felt a little bit like a hacker. These are areas I'd never dreamed I would encounter in my graduate work in women's and gender studies. Yet still, with patience and increasing skill, our team came up with newer and more precise topic models of the archive. With ongoing decisions about visualization, accessibility, and aesthetics, Signs at 40 began to emerge as a constellation of tools and routes into new feminist scholarship. Mary's guidance and foresight throughout the past 2 years has been phenomenal, and it is through her deep encouragement and support that we as a team felt like we were producing something of value. It's been a challenge and a pleasure to watch the project evolve, from Susanna and I sitting by ourselves with our database in the basement of Voorhees Chapel, to offering up what we have created today. I've pushed my own boundaries intellectually and technically in helping to create the topic model, and through the chance to edit curated contents in areas that I'm passionate about in my own work. I just wanted to end with a thank you to all who allowed my first few years of doctoral study to be infused and sustained by the past, present, and future of science. Thank you.
I will briefly talk about the 10 curated tables of content. Okay. The 10 curated tables of content highlight areas of investigation, themes, and concepts that have been central to the contents of science throughout its 4 decades of publication. While the computer-assisted topic modeling produced sets of words that co-occur and traced variations in the frequency of their occurrence over time, the curated tables of content also reflect our own intellectual orientations in the field of feminism. The areas of feminist thought that we decided to work with were, and you have them there, I'm going to read them, intersectionalities, interventions in feminist theory, methodologies, bodies, identities, differences, science studies, political and social movements, cultural production, labor and political economy, field formation, violence and conflict. Each list consists of 20 articles which demonstrate the transformations undergone by each area over the course of 4 decades. For instance, Antti Mazacci's curation of intersectionalities features articles that employ analysis of multiple systems of power and interacting structures of inequality even before the coinage of the term intersectionality by Kimberly Crenshaw. The articles included in the intersectionality list reflect the crucial role of Black feminists in, quote, generating the analytical tools that have enabled sophisticated scholarly treatments of the interactions among race, class, gender, geopolitical context, nation, and sexuality, end quote. In Interventions in Theory, Lindsay Whitmore traces 2 types of changes that shape the landscape of feminist theory. First, there are, quote from Lindsay, the quotes are from the persons who curated each individual list. So first, there are, quote, intentional shifts in the use of key thematics, methods, and languages of critique, end quote. And second, and very importantly, the articles published in Science participate in, quote, disassembling and reconstituting the boundaries of what and who counts in the production and circulation of knowledges, end quote. Each list of articles also points to an inspiring diversity of approaches in relation to the 10 broad areas of feminist thought that we decided to curate. In the list on feminist methodologies, this diversity articulates along the lines of feminist interventions in the reconfiguration of epistemological assumptions, methods of inquiry, standards of evidence within and across traditional disciplines. Another trajectory shows a preoccupation with multiple and mixed methods of research, as Andrew already pointed out, crossing the lines between the qualitative and the quantitative, the visual and the narrative. The commitment to interdisciplinarity further produced research frameworks that were able to problematize the orientalized practices of representation and to denaturalize the hegemony of Western knowledge production. These particular directions could be further engaged in Lindsay's curation cultural production, which brings together contributors who tackle such questions in their analysis of visual culture, representation, but also affect, emotion, cultural politics, intimacy, silencing and censorship, valuation and devaluation. In political and social movements, the heterogeneity of feminist scholarship can be traced in relation to historical context, spaces of mobilization, and social change agendas. Susan Galland's curation thus features analysis of, quote, early mobilizations for women's rights, the articulation of feminist and LGBTQ discourses within mainstream institutions, and the creation of autonomous women's groups and communities, alongside inquiries into the politics of everyday resistance and more recent examinations of, quote, transnational and intra-regional networks and the emergence of neoliberal forms of humanitarian activism. In the introduction of her second curation, Violence and Conflict, Susanna mentioned Rosemary Marangoli George's article, Extraordinary Violence, National Literatures, Diasporic Aesthetics, and the Politics of Gender in South Asian Partition Fiction. George's article was published in the War and Terror special issue in 2007, and I'm mentioning it now in order to draw attention to the organization of information and the layout of the curated tables of content. As you can see, the sidebar, and Susanna talked about this as well, the sidebar provides a list of all the special issues, comparative perspectives, symposia, roundtables, and article clusters which tackle gender violence and women's participation in conflicts. By looking at the right sidebar, the reader of Science at 40 may draw conclusions about diverse editorial approaches and their role in promoting the topicality of certain paradigms within these larger frames of feminist thought. Engaging with a curated table of contents for the areas of labor and political economy, field formations, and science studies, in conjunction with the information provided in the sidebars, gives a sense of the broader social and political context and of the swift responsiveness of feminist knowledge production to socio-political, cultural, and economic transformations. Finally, the curated content lists testify to the dialogic spirit of feminist knowledge production. In Bodies, Identities, and Differences, Lindsay emphasized the vital exchanges that structure the sites of body theorizing. Similarly, in field formations, Andy Mazzacci foregrounds moments of contestation and reconceptualization of the Women's Studies project by including articles that tackle, quote, the shifting exclusions, lacunae, and hegemonic impulses contained within the organizational structure of the field, its institutional forms, and the conceptual frameworks employed within it, end quote. Like everyone before me, I cannot end this presentation without acknowledging the extraordinary leadership, the sophisticated vision, and the deep knowledge that Mary has brought to science for the past 10 years. Thank you.
Well, you all know that birthday parties and anniversary parties are a time to bring together all of our loved ones, and there are people in this room without whom science would not exist. So the very first person I want to thank before we start moving on to the eating and drinking is Joanne Gavant, who 10 years ago, in her role as Department Administrator of Women's and Gender Studies, had the enormous challenge of finding 5 offices for this journal. And you all know that space is not the new frontier of universities, but the battleground. So Joanne went to a former chair of Women's and Gender Studies, then Dean of Douglas College, Harriet Davidson, and they had this nice little quiet conversation on the side. And the next thing you know, we had a derelict suite of offices in the basement of Voorhees Chapel, the very space where women's studies had started on Douglas College 30 years before, and within 6 weeks, Joanne got those offices refurbished, carpeted, new furniture, painted. It was astonishing, and only those of you who are Rutgers people know how astonishing that was. In addition to Joanne, the very earliest science team included Dawn Harris. Dawn? PhD candidate from the University of Toronto who was working on her dissertation about slave practices in the Caribbean in the slavery period. Excellent, yes, that long, long slavery period. And she applied for this job along with 200 other people to be an editorial assistant for the journal. And I said, you are way overqualified. She said, well, I'd find it interesting. So here I hired a person like 17 times more qualified than possibly could be required. And Dawn helped us set up the science offices and provided vital work until she became a professor herself. Another one of our earliest contributors to science is Karen Alexander, who came to be our senior editor, from London, a quick jump across the Atlantic Ocean. And Karen was absolutely crucial in the globalization of the journal. We wanted to do comparative perspective symposia, and for the first two, I had networks. Okay, I can do democratization. I know people in lots of places. I can do Islamization, because I know people in lots of places. Well, then we had 4 times 9 is 36 plus 2. We had 38 issues to go. Okay, what will be the topics? Who will be contributing? How will we find out that we can always have at least 4 different countries represented? Often as many as 8, or in the most recent project by Miranda Kramer and Susanna Galan. How many did you end up with? 13 for the gendered bodies in protest spheres? But Karen also was a vital member of the science community until she became a dean of Douglas College. So a nice stepping stone to wonderful futures. Amari Verostigi, who is also with us today, came in to the journal, we skipped one person. Deanna Utrosky came post-dawn and pre-Amari. Amari joined our team, and Amari had this brilliant idea that we should be nominating science articles for Best Article Prize Awards in lots of different disciplines. So she did all this research to find out, who offered prizes for what, and then she would give us deadlines. You can apply for this award by this date, this date, this date, this date, and this date. It's like, whoa. So we start writing letters, and wouldn't you know, we start winning prizes. So last year, science articles won the 2 top prizes from the MLA, top gender prize from American Sociological Association, and 1 more from religious studies, and that's all thanks to Amari saying, oh, these are great articles, we should be nominating them. And Amari worked with us until she too moved on to another more glorious and more highly paid, I must say, future at Rutgers. So those are some of our itinerant partners, but we also have constant partners. And our most constant partner of all, birthdays and anniversaries are gift-giving times. So I want to give a few gifts today, first to our absolutely most constant partner. We're going big for 40. Miranda Outman Kramer came to Science from the University of California, Los Angeles. She moved with the journal, and when we were thinking in the 3 months we had to get ready for bringing this important journal to our campus, we thought, we don't know what we're doing. We don't have a clue how we're going to do it. We knew we needed space, but that was just the beginning. And when Miranda indicated the possibility of coming some 3,000 miles for this journal, we hopped at the chance. She brought with her a wealth of information. She knew everybody at the University of Chicago Press. She knew every of the 6 billion deadlines that come every year. She has an extraordinary rapport with authors. They write us thank you notes about how fabulous it has been to work with Miranda. She's been wonderful at training graduate student graduate student researchers and undergraduate interns. Some years we had 4 interns a semester. Miranda not only trained them, but kind of mothered them, took care of them, made them part of the science family, helped prepare them so that they would do public presentations celebrating their science work, and managed to do spectacular copy the editing and keeping us on production schedule. So Miranda, thank you very, very, very much. When Karen Alexander was given a job offer at Douglas College, the women's college at Rutgers University, we all celebrated that possibility, but we were thinking, oh, how are we possibly going to keep doing what Karen had done? And we knew that when we placed an advertisement in a newspaper, we would get hundreds of applicants, as we consistently did when there was a job opening. But you need a very particular kind of intellectual versatility, creativity, to do the work of taking care of all the 800 books that get submitted to the journal every year, figuring out who should be reviewing them, hounding the reviewers to submit their reviews, comparative perspective symposium, rounding up the contributors. So it was with, I can't tell you what joy, such extraordinary joy, that Andy Masacci, also a PhD student at that time, applied for the job of, it was senior editor, we changed the title to deputy editor, we were working on career trajectories, we thought it had a little more oomph. But Andy stepped into that role and it was totally seamless. I had thought no one will ever replace Karen Alexander, but Andy did. And he also followed his own inclinations, said to me something about blogging, tweeting, whatever say I. Well, don't you know, after Andy had been creating a new website, blogging, tweeting, all of a sudden our subscriptions went up? Like, whoa. So, a special thank you to Andy Masacci for his And again, when our editorial assistant decided she needed to move on because she got this was Ann Keefe at the time, she got a very prestigious postdoc in Emory. Oh yes, that little school down in Atlanta. A hugely important postdoc in poetics at Emory. So we again started doing a national search, and Laura Lovine, a PhD candidate in women's and gender studies, applied for the position at that time and has come to the office and has helped us enormously with acquisitions, with the Digital Humanities Project, with curating the table of contents, with rounding up all of the people who say they're going to review manuscripts and then disappear into cyberspace as she hunts them out. So Laura, thank you so much. Then the final people I want to thank are in two categories, both of which I think count as invisible labor. Category one is the administrative offices at Women's and Gender Studies. Rutgers systems malfunction occasionally, whether you're talking about heating and cooling, whether you're talking about computing, whether you're talking about RIAS. So we have been very fortunate over the past decade to work with Susie Kiefer in the Office of Women's and Gender Studies. Susie? Much more recently, Monique Gregory, is Monique here? Monique has joined us as the Department Administrator. Just at that point when we have to do synthetic budgets for 10 whole years in order to figure out how much is in the revolving account from the University of Chicago, Monique has come to the fore, so we are ever so grateful to Monique. And finally, I am so very grateful to the associate editors, some of whom are in the room today, many of whom contributed comments to our virtual issue, all of whom have served as reviewers, all of whom have come to 2 meetings a year to brainstorm, to think about what should be in the journal, to help us find international contacts for comparative perspective symposia, who have been ambassadors for the journal when they go to conferences. hearing great papers and saying you should submit to signs. So would all of our associate editors just pop up for 1 second for a thanks and a round of applause? You know who you are. And as Kate mentioned in her statement at the beginning of the session, we at Signs love bubbly. So we are going to have a toast to celebrate 40 years down and 100 to go. And I'm thankful to Phil Alperson for popping a lot of corks and starting pouring champagne. Oh, and good, Barry Qualls, the man, the man who was Dean of Humanities when we first went as a delegation and said to the Dean of Humanities, we would like to bring the lead journal in feminist scholarship to campus. We need money. Barry, you definitely deserve our thanks. And we are also grateful to the continuing support from SAS Dean's Office. I see Jim Michelli, and I thought I saw Jimmy Swinson. Well, see, many demands on their time, but you all know we've been under budget cut, and budget cut, so we are deeply grateful to the Dean's Office for keeping us afloat through the whole decade. Thank you very much. So I hope you will all get some champagne, and we will have a toast to our future.
If I can ask for just a very small moment of people's time, I won't keep people away from champagne for long at all. But I know that I speak on behalf of all the science staff when I say that working with Mary has been an extraordinary gift. Her, professionally and personally, her leadership has, without question, been a gift to Rutgers, to the University of Chicago Press, to all of the authors of signs, and to all the readers, past, present, and future. This is a small token of our appreciation.
So we now have to orchestrate a delivery system so the champagne gets into your hands.